to welcome all of you to the 24th Frank and Kula Kumpuris Distinguished Lecture. Please join me first and foremost in thanking the Kumpuris family, and the Clinton School of Public Service for their commitment to this lecture series and ongoing support. The Kumpuris Lecture Series was created to encourage compelling dialogue and create a deeper awareness about current events and the global affairs that shape the world we live in. Before we begin our program today, I'd like to recognize some distinguished guests who are with us. Former Governor Jim Tucker, Attorney General Leslie Rutledge, former Attorney General Dustin McDaniel, several members of the Arkansas General Assembly, former White House Chief of Staff Matt McClarty, General Wesley Clark, Mayor Mark Stodola, Director of the Clinton Presidential Library Terry Garner, and Dean of the Clinton School of Public Service Skip Rutherford, who you'll have the opportunity to hear from later in our program. Our Kumpuris Distinguished Lecturer this afternoon is the Right Honourable Tony Blair. Tony Blair served as Prime Minister of Great Britain and Northern Ireland from 1997 to 2007, the only Labour leader in the party's 100-year history to win 3 consecutive elections. During his time in office, the UK economy enjoyed record growth. His government made major improvements in Britain's public services, particularly healthcare and education, through a program of education and reform. Our moderator today is the Honourable Alexis Herman. During the Clinton administration, she served as Secretary of Labor. Currently, Secretary Herman serves as Chair and Chief Executive of New Ventures LLC. She has continued to lend her expertise and talents to a vast array of corporate enterprises and nonprofit organizations. She is a recipient of more than 20 honorary doctorate degrees from major colleges and universities around the country and is a trustee of the National Urban League. She currently serves as the chair of the Presidential Leadership Scholars Advisory Committee and moderated a fascinating panel discussion yesterday with Presidents Clinton and Bush and Prime Minister Blair at the Presidential Scholars graduation ceremony at a very interesting weather event at Central High School yesterday afternoon. So please help me welcome to the stage Secretary Alexis Herman and the Honourable Tony Blair.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you, Stephanie, for your kind words, for your leadership and service under the library. I'm delighted to be here today to participate in this conversation with Prime Minister Blair. As Stephanie indicated, yesterday we had both an enlightening and delightful conversation that included President Bush, President Clinton, and of course the Prime Minister. But today, we get to hear more directly from Prime Minister Blair, especially now about his continued work on the world stage. So, Prime Minister, let me begin with the first question. And I'd like to ask you about your work now. You're doing so many things with your different foundations. Could you share with us what that work involves for you today?
Thank you, Alexis, and thank you, everyone. It's a very great pleasure to be here in Little Rock, Arkansas. This has been my first visit. Your weather is interesting. So Alexis said to me yesterday, she said, do you ever have tornadoes in Britain? I said, well, we get the odd gust of wind, but that was quite something last night. So it's a real pleasure, and to be here in this presidential centre, which I have to say is absolutely magnificent. But I'd also like to say that I've obviously, because of President Clinton, I've read a lot about Little Rock over the years, but it's the first time I've been able to see the city properly, and I drove a little bit around today, and it's a beautiful city as well, so you can be very proud of it. I mean, it's a great place. So I hope this is my first one, my last visit, but just next time, just give me a British one. So the work I do since I left office is really around one common theme, which is how do you make globalization work? Because I believe that globalization is a force that is driven essentially by people and by technology, by the changes in the world. It's not really a policy driven by government. So it's a fact. And the world is going to carry on becoming smaller, getting closer together. And the question is, what holds back that process working so that not just a few, but the many participate in the benefits? Okay, so I then really focused on two things particularly that arose out of my work as Prime Minister. The first is Africa. When I was Prime Minister, I created a whole new development department for the UK. We never had one before. We created one. I'm pleased to say it's now a kind of leader in development. We then gave a commitment to increasing our aid as a percentage of our GDP every year. We have now one of the largest aid budgets in the world. And in 2005 at the G8 summit, I actually made Africa the centerpiece of that summit. Debt cancellation, increases in aid. The USA did its PEPFAR program, which is one of the most remarkable and successful programs in modern political history. And so I wanted then to continue my work in Africa, but I wanted to do it, and in each part, a different way of doing an important thing so that we're also influencing global policy. So even though in Africa, we made these big commitments when I was in government on aid and development. Now I have an initiative called the Africa Governance Initiative, and I focus on the quality of governance. So I think, we can talk a bit about this more, the difference between countries that succeed and fail today is really the quality of governance. So aid is important, we should keep that, but in the end, unless you build the institutions and capacity of government to govern sensibly and well and get things done, then you don't make progress. So we have teams of people that work in African countries, they sit and work alongside the president's teams, and they help deliver change. So that's one thing. And governance is one, poor governance is what holds globalization back, okay? Because countries are often poor, but rich in resources. So unless you get decent government, you can't make use of the potential the country has. So that's one aspect. The second aspect is really around this whole issue of extremism based on a perversion of religion. And this was something I obviously dealt with after 9/11. It became a big part of my premiership. Through 9/11, Afghanistan, Iraq, all the different things that we were engaged in as a country. And what I wanted to do after leaving was to study this and try and put forward a comprehensive strategy that didn't just look at the security and military aspects of this, but the underlying ideology that is driving this extremism. So today we have programs in 20 different countries, which are about educating people, allowing young people to explore difference, to link up with people of different faiths across the world. We have an idea that we're putting forward together at the moment for what I call a global commitment on education, whose purpose is really, rather emulating the global commitment on the environment today, is to say there should be a global commitment by countries on education, where each country undertakes that within their education system, you will promote religious tolerance and respect and root out religious prejudice. Because the truth is there are millions of young people every day being educated, I'm afraid, to a closed-minded view of the world. Now, one aspect of that work on extremism is also the Middle East, and the Middle East peace process specifically. And I was just saying to Alexis, I'm probably 2 or 3 times a month in the Middle East. I have 2 offices out there. I spend a lot of time working on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, which is tough. But so those are the 2 things that I most do, and they're both very big challenges. But in each case, what I'm trying to do is not just make a difference in the specific work, but also make a difference to the way we look at these issues globally. So, in a nutshell, that's what it's about.
Let me build on what you just said, because obviously your efforts are helping to foster real cooperation. And we know that in the face of so many global challenges, the threat of terrorism now is everywhere, not just in the UK, here in the US, and we only need to look at what happened yesterday in France. Can you give us your particular frame of terrorism? How do you see it? You talked about your work in the educational space especially, but what is your frame on terrorism today from your perspective, and how can these efforts actually perhaps help us more?
What happened in France yesterday is obviously a terrible tragedy, and you know, France has suffered so much over these past couple of years in these terrorist attacks, and my heart really goes out to the French people because they don't deserve this. It's a great country, a resilient country. It's a country of culture and civilization, and these barbaric attacks which target the most innocent people in the most random way are terrible, and I'm afraid they bring home to us the global nature of this problem. And so in my foundation, we study this extremism. We have you can go to our website, and every day we do a daily tracker which shows you across the world what is happening. From the Middle East to Africa to Europe to Asia. The global nature of this is now very, very clear. So we often focus on the Middle East, or where there's a terrible attack in Europe, we will focus on Europe. But I would say in the northern part of sub-Saharan Africa today, this is probably the biggest single inhibitor in development. So, you know, you can go across from Nigeria through Mali, Chad, Niger, Somalia, you know, all of these countries suffering violent conflict, and in each case, of course, making it harder for people to come and invest, harder for people to start businesses, harder for the societies to stabilize. So here is this is an area where there's many, many different views, but I'll just give you mine. This is a strain that has developed within Islam over the past, I would say, 70, 80 years. So it's not a really recent phenomenon, but neither is it the historical truth about Islam. And the truth is, the vast majority of people who practice Islam do it in a peaceful and decent and honorable way and want to cooperate with those across the boundaries of faith. But in my view, you have to recognize that this ideology that politicized religion in this extreme way is an ideology that has this strong religious derivation. And therefore, my view is that you need to deal with it at a number of different levels. First, you have to deal with the actual security aspects of it. Okay, and ever since 9/11, the world's been doing this, and heaven knows how many hundreds of billions of dollars we spend on protection and security as a result of it. I think you also have to have the capacity, and this is much more controversial, of dealing with this terrorism wherever it gets territory anywhere in the world. One of the reasons why it's so important that we defeat ISIS is that one of the recruiting mechanisms that these extremists use is this so-called concept of the caliphate. And the fact that they hold territory allows them to recruit. And in my view, you, ourselves, the whole of the world has a profound interest in making sure they cannot hold that territory and they are driven out of it. So there are security and military aspects of this, and we can go into those in more detail. But then thirdly, let me just explain what I mean by this educational component. Around half a century ago, we started to export out of the Middle East a way of educating and thinking that is based on a very, very narrow view of religion. which is basically, this is the view of Islam. If you do not agree with this, then you are our enemy. So it's not just if you're of a different religion, it's if you're a different persuasion within the religion. Okay. And if you teach young children, and there are millions of them every day taught in this way, nothing but a particular version of the Quran from early in the morning till late at night, to the exclusion often of science and technology, to the exclusion of the type of critical thinking that is a necessary part of any education system in the modern world, you cannot be surprised if a proportion of those people become extremists. And here's the thing which is difficult. The numbers of actual fanatics who go and kill and behave in the way that ISIS do, you could measure in tens of thousands. Unfortunately, the leading clerics who will advocate the ideology, their support you measure in many millions. And this is why is, I'm afraid, a deeper problem than I think we realize. And what I'm really meaning about education is that there are countries, and there are often countries with whom we have strong diplomatic and political relationships. I'm afraid we've got to put this issue on the table and say, I'm sorry, we can't have a situation where you are polluting the minds of large numbers of young people. And, you know, in the environment, we now say, what you do within your own boundary is not just your business. Right? When this climate change movement first began, some countries said, look, what we do within our territory is up to us. Don't tell us what to do. Over time, we've managed to move people's thinking on this. And now, adequately or inadequately, all countries accept there is this obligation. We've got to do the same with education. And we've got to say to people, no, we are going to have to discuss with you how you reform. We'll help you reform. We'll provide you with the materials for reformation, but we can't have you teaching young people in this way, because this is a problem for us and not just for you. Now, I personally believe that the big difference between now and when I was in office is that I think there is a real alliance that you can build within the Muslim world, where many of these governments actually want our help in making these changes because they know this is a problem for them. I mean, the vast majority of victims of terrorism in the world today are Muslim. Right? So the third aspect of this is education. The fourth aspect is around a movement that is beginning now within Islam. And again, you know, we study this in detail within our foundation, where clerics are coming forward and putting forward a theological justification as to why this violence is completely contrary to the proper teaching of the Quran, which it is. So this is, you know, you need at every level, and then frankly, you've got to take a much more aggressive view of the social media network, where people are radicalized, where people are gaining access to material. My foundation will publish a study in the next few months just showing the sheer scale of the social media activity of these Salafi jihadist movements. And, you know, the reality is, I'm afraid, millions of people are going into these sites all the time. Now, some of them may be going in for information and general interest, but I'm afraid some of them will be going in and becoming radicalized as a result. So this is it is the single biggest security problem we face in the world today, I think, and it's going to require, in my view, a much more comprehensive strategy and a much deeper strategy than the one we have at the moment.
I want to talk more about how we actually engage people on those strategies, but just for a moment, if you could stay with the point you've just raised in the Middle East, because I'm sure many in our audience know that you were the Middle East envoy for the quartet. You've had a really deep initiative, particularly in the last 2 years. And while many world leaders obviously pay attention and know a great deal about the political issues in the Middle East, you're there. You're traveling in and out of the region. Could you just share for a moment your own take on the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, your work there, and any predictions for the future?
After the Brexit vote, I'm a little...
We'll get to that too.
I'm a little short on predictions. So when I go back to Israel, as I will very soon, and the Palestinian territories. I mean, this will be my 182nd visit since leaving office. So, as my wife always says, it's not actually the number of visits you make, it's the progress that counts. Which I didn't think was very supportive, to be, I'm truthful about it. But so I am there a lot, and here's one of the bizarre reflections I have, which is a slightly troubling reflection I have, in fact, about, when you're in office and when you leave office. I mean, my understanding of these issues is obviously significantly deeper than it was when I was Prime Minister, which is interesting reflection. But that's the way political lives are. But in my view, this is still fundamental. I think there is a great new opportunity in the Middle East peace process at the moment, which is the potential for the Israelis and the Arabs, not just the Israelis and the Palestinians, to cooperate together. And I say that because one of the things that's come out of all the turmoil in the Middle East, and the Arab Spring particularly, which began in 2011 and has just convulsed the region, the Arabs and the Israelis in many ways have very common strategic interests. Right? They are both worried about the theocratic power of the Iranian regime and the export of that Iranian destabilization around the region. They are very worried on the Sunni side of Muslim Brotherhood through to ISIS. And so both the Arab countries and Israel face in many ways the same security anxieties. In addition, frankly, if they could find a way to work together, the possibilities economically and strategically for the two to work together are enormous. And there is a new leadership in the Arab world, in the Gulf states, in Egypt. The King of Jordan, obviously a very intelligent, sensible man. There is the possibility of a new leadership that can put behind the legacy of the past. And sometimes what happens is in situations of chaos and turmoil comes opportunity. And I think that opportunity is there. But it can't be accessed, that door remains shut, and the key to it is the Palestinian issue. Now, I think that if the Israelis, as I think this is possible, are prepared to be at least open to the Arab Peace Initiative as a framework within which you debate this, and recently the Prime Minister in Israel made a statement effectively moving in that direction, and we concentrate on improving radically the lives of Palestinians on the ground in Gaza and West Bank, then I think a combination of on-the-ground change and political movement could at least give us the ability to start fashioning that key to unlock that door. The position of America is obviously extremely important. I saw Secretary Kerry just a couple of days ago. He remains, and I have to say, I think it's a great tribute to him, despite all the other things he's got to worry about, and there's a lot of them, he remains absolutely committed to this. So his and America's participation is very important. But I think this issue remains fundamentally important. Israel remains, by the way, fundamentally important to our security in the West, and we should never forget that. But I think there is the possibility of a changed set of relationships in the Middle East, and if that happened, then I think you would open up a much more optimistic sense of possibility in the region. Now, right now, when you look at the region and you look at the news, you kind of think, well, how can that be right? I mean, you see conflict and destruction on every side, but it's because there is this common interest, and because really what this whole struggle in the Middle East is about how do the people in the Middle East overcome the legacy of, frankly, bad politics mixed with an abuse of religion. Because that is the fundamental question, there is really an interest both with the Israelis and the Arabs in overcoming this, because otherwise their economies can't function and they won't have peace and stability in the region. So it's I will continue to spend a huge amount of time on it. I mean, I'm very passionate about it, and it influences in a very profound way this other issue of extremism. Not because the Israeli-Palestinian issue is the cause of the extremism, but because if you were able to get Arabs and Israelis working together, what a great blow that would be in favor of peaceful coexistence between people of different faiths. So that's why it's important still, and why I'll carry on giving my all to it.
Well, listening to you, you remain not only passionate, but hopeful. And
Yeah,
I
but
think
people often think that I'm a crazy optimist. So I am. Yeah.
Yeah, but that hope encourages us all. And that hope was so apparent yesterday in the conversation with President Bush and President Clinton. And to see the three of you there, particularly I think for those in the United States who are always amazed to know that these two presidents are actually collaborating together on an important initiative like the Presidential Scholars Leadership Program. But you had the opportunity to work with both of them. And yesterday, you shared stories that I'd like for you to share with this audience about some of your fondest memories of working with our two presidents.
Yeah, I know. I mean, whenever people, because often people sort of say to me, well, you're a close friend of President Clinton's, you're a close friend of President Bush's, and they kind of go, So how does that work out? And of course, at one level, British prime ministers should always get on well with the president of the United States. But, as you could see yesterday, they actually have a very good chemistry between each other, partly because here's a great insight, they're very different. But there are points at which they come together, which are also important in today's context, by the way. Both will stand up for sensible positions on immigration, which I personally think is very important, right? Both are against isolationism. Both are in favor of an economy that is interdependent. So whatever the differences, there are actually common points of agreement, and they work extremely well together. So the story is now, so with President Clinton, see, one of the things, because we have the British system of prime minister's questions, which is one of the craziest questions I ever get asked is, especially by people here or, Japan as a whole cable TV program dedicated to prime minister's questions. And they say to me, do you ever miss that, prime minister's questions? I say, do I miss prime ministers? Are you crazy? I mean, so, but Bill Clinton's probably one of the few people who could do that with ease. And the very first time I went to see him was in 1996, early 1996, and I was the leader of the opposition, the Labour Party opposition, and my election was going to be coming up in early 97, and of course he was standing for re-election as president. And this was a big moment, right? Because I was the leader of the opposition getting to see the US president, okay? So this had to go well, okay? So again, especially my party had been out of power for 18 years, so we really needed to do well. So anyway, I get the meeting arranged. I go to see him in the Oval Office. I'm obviously very excited. What happens is you sit, the visiting dignitary from abroad sits with the president like we're sitting now in those two chairs in the Oval Office. And then the tradition is that the media from America and then from the foreign country, they come in two waves, right? And there's a sort of scrum and they throw questions, right? So anyway, the British media comes in and we're sitting here like this. And one of the British press shouts to President Clinton, Mr. President, do you think you're sitting alongside the next British Prime Minister? And I freeze at this, because this is a hard question, right? Now, he can't say yes, because there's an existing British Prime Minister. So if he says yes, that's a diplomatic faux pas. He can't say that. On the other hand, if he says no, this has not been a good visit, right? So quick as a flash, what Bill Clinton says is, look, I just hope he's sitting alongside the next president of the United States. So, saved us both.
Yeah.
And the other conversation which I tell about President Bush, but actually it's not quite the one last night. It was when we did our first G8 summit together, and President Bush had just begun in office. I had been Prime Minister for a few years by that time. And anyway, at the G8, what happens is the European guys turn up, and whoever is president has the presidency of Europe. It's a rotating 6-month presidency, country to country. They also turn up at this thing. Anyway, we were having this debate, and President Bush just came literally on time as we sat down. We were having a debate about climate change. And the Prime Minister of Belgium, who was the President of Europe at the time, he's giving this big speech in favor of action on climate change, and you know how controversial that was back then in your politics, probably still is, but it was even more controversial then. Anyway, the Prime Minister of Belgium says, "I'm delighted President Bush has come in, because I'd like to say to him that I think one of his first acts as US President should be to triple gasoline prices in order to help the fight against climate change, because this will make him a hero in many parts of the world like Belgium." And so anyway, President Bush is listening to this, and he turns in and he says, "Who in the hell is this guy?" So I said to him as the Prime Minister of Belgium, he said, "Belgium's not part of the G8. I said, "No, he's the President of Europe." He said, "You got the Belgians running Europe." Anyway, so as you can see from yesterday, as you would see, Avril, when you were there, they actually have a great rapport and sense of humor together. And one of the things I think is really important in politics today is that we don't lose this idea of people across the political divide working with each other, because you've got issues here, let's say. We've got issues back home as well and across Europe. And in the end, look, the problems that nations face today, they face in common. These are challenges in common. And the solutions are often complex and difficult. They have to be practical and not just rhetorical. And to get there, you need people of good faith, even if they come from different traditions, being prepared at certain points to work with each other and cooperate with each other. And that's why I think it's great with that Presidential Scholars Program. It's a fantastic program. It's good that you do that, not just in itself, but in the signal it sends.
You mentioned we have issues back home. Obviously, we touched on the Brexit vote yesterday. But today, I'd like to get a bit more granular. I'd like to ask you not only just your own take on the vote itself, but specifically, what do you think brought about the Brexit vote? And would you comment on any particular impacts that you see going forward, not just for Europe, but perhaps for our US-UK relationships?
What drove the Brexit vote is what's driving politics in many parts of the world. A sense of alienation people have from political systems. A view that there's a political elite that's out of touch with the people. I think social media is itself a revolutionary phenomenon which allows insurgent movements to grow at scale and at speed in a way that when I was first in politics never happened. So I think there's all of that. Europe has always been a controversial issue in British politics. But you could actually have that referendum in virtually any country in Europe at the moment, and you would have a very open result. So even though the British had the referendum and have voted to leave, You know, you've got one of the leading politicians in France saying they should leave. You've got one of the leading politicians in Holland making the same type of case, in Italy. You know, this is all over. And the problem is this, and it's a very, you know, I'm not sure I totally understand it, by the way. And one thing that's been quite humbling for me, and interesting and somewhat discomforting, has been the degree to which, having spent a lifetime in politics and thinking, you know, I was quite good at it, I'm wondering, am I understanding it? Because I'm not sure I'm trying very hard, by the way, but I'm not, and I'm thinking a lot about it, but I'm not sure I fully understand it. But here's the problem, because Brexit is a classic example of this phenomenon. A lot of people voted as a protest. But the fact is, it wasn't a protest, it was a decision. And a decision is different from a protest. Right? When you protest, you're protesting against the person making the decision. Okay, that's fine. They carry on, they make the decision. Yes or no, or whatever. If you become the decision maker for a day, you can't have in your mind the thought of making a protest, because actually you're making a decision, and that decision has consequences. Now, the truth is with Brexit, is it was 52 to 48, but the consequence afterwards has been that our economy has definitely suffered a setback. Indeed, the global economy has suffered a setback. Our currency is down about 11%, which is pretty high. We have lost quite a lot of money off the value of our companies. The property market is now looking at as if it's going to dip, which has got an impact on the economy. We may even, I hope not, but some people are saying we may even go into recession. So it wasn't a protest, it was a decision. And I think one of the things we've got to do in these circumstances is to focus people's minds on this and say to them, okay, we understand the anger, and by the way, we need answers to the anger and not just anger, but you know, be careful you don't do something where you think, right, I'm making my point against you guys who are the system, and actually you end up taking a decision that drives your country in a way that's you didn't really intend, right? So now, Britain is a strong country, it's a confident country, you know, we'll get through whether we go through with this Brexit or not. But it's had a huge impact within Europe, and it's had huge impact within Britain. I'm actually very worried that Scotland will want another referendum now about the UK, in which case, you know, you could be looking up at the breakup of the UK. We've had a change of prime minister. It was only a year since David Cameron won an election victory that most people consider an extraordinary victory. A year on, he's out of office. We've got a new prime minister. We haven't had an election. So, you know, this was a big decision with a lot of consequences. And I think one thing that will happen in the future now is that the 48% who voted to stay, who are quite centre ground, I think, are going to be saying, where's our political home? You know, because my party, as you can see, has also got its issues. So this is a new, you know, we're in a new political era. And I think it's not just about Britain. I mean, we happen to have gone down the full way and taken the decision. But I think you can see this virtually anywhere you look in Europe or maybe even here.
For sure. Interestingly enough, I say to my colleagues who brought the questions up, all of them were on Brexit. But there is one worth noting, the footnote, when they asked about Brexit, and you actually just answered their question. But the footnote here was, we want you to know that we think that you are the greatest prime minister since Winston Churchill, and we thank you for being here.
I didn't know my brother was in the audience, but thanks. That's good of you.
But as you talked about really this face of rising populism really in both the UK, here in the United States, as we look really to the global community. What do you think practically politicians can do to re-engage voters in the face of rising populism?
God, you know, if I was really sure, Alexis, of the answer to that, I'd be running again. I mean, I think the centre ground's got to get more muscular and has got to stand up more strongly. Because you see, the trouble is you've got a world today in which politics is a lot more fragmented. I mean, let me just give you an example from the UK. When I was starting in politics, the BBC had the 10 o'clock news every evening, right? And a large part of our population would tune into that. If you compare sizes of populations, you might get 60, 70 million, an American equivalent, would turn into the BBC News. So there was one conversation. And if you wanted to participate in politics, you were part of that conversation, right? And the point about that is, because it was one conversation, it gravitated towards reaching out. Because if you wanted to be part of that conversation, obviously the people tuning in had lots of different views, so it really, the impulsion within that was for people to work together. What's happened now with the media, at least in our places, become much more fragmented. It has become much more partisan, because then the media realizes, look, if I'm a sort of leftish paper, I've got the left, that's my constituency. And what's the best way of keeping that constituency? It's to make them permanently angry about whatever they're angry about, okay? So, you know, the bankers, let's say. Okay, if you're on the right and you want to keep that constituency, you've got to make them, again, permanently angry. What are they going to get angry about? Well, they'll probably get angry about immigration if you put it to them in the right way. So what you've got is a situation where you've got that fragmented conversation, and then social media, this is why I say it's a revolutionary phenomenon. You know, when it first began, I thought it might civilize the discourse. Right. Got that one wrong for sure. But it doesn't. It actually makes it incivil in a really quite profound way. I mean, occasionally, I don't often do this is not good for my blood pressure. You know, you read some of the things people say on social media and you think, oh my God, do people really speak like that? I mean, you know, but they do. And therefore what that does is it then augments that sense, right? Here's my tribe. That's where I belong. That's what we think. And we're not interested in a conversation with you because actually making you our enemy makes us feel good about ourselves. And then what politics becomes is it becomes about you expressing your feeling. It doesn't become about you saying, okay, I'm looking at these difficult issues and what's best for the country. And that then makes the politicians also become more fragmented and partisan, because they then think, look, if I want to go and get the nomination, I'm going to have to play to this, right? And then you get reasonable people having to trade, right, across the boundary of what they think and what they think others think. Okay, this is not healthy. It's really not healthy. So what do we do about it? I think in the end, you know, I'm really looking at this in Britain because I think it's very fundamental. Because, I'm looking at that 48%, and that 48% have now got a Conservative government that's Brexit, and that's it. They're going down the road of Brexit. And you've got a Labour Party that's gone very to the left, and they're sitting there thinking, I've got no political home. And here's the other thing, which you can't really say very loudly, but in a sense it's true. The centre-right and the centre-left have quite a lot in common, in many ways. Okay, but tradition and history and the way things have grown up divide them. So, what all this means is that I think there's going to have to be the development of a new agenda which is providing real answers, and sometimes quite radical answers, to real problems. Because if you're sitting there and your income's not risen in the last 10 years, and you've got all these problems, and you don't think anyone's listening to you, you've got to the one thing people like me have got to do is take on board, right? There's something going on out there that's different, and you've got to realize it and understand it and move towards it. But you've got to be in the position where that center becomes a center for radical answers and not a means of exploiting anger. And that's where we are at the moment. And I think, you know, this is a sort of global thing that's going on. And it's you know, in my more pessimistic moments, I'll be very honest with you. In my more pessimistic moments, I think maybe we've got to go through the experiment to realize the danger. But, you know, these experiments, as you can see from history, can end very badly. So this, I mean, my sense is, and I've become a lot more motivated about all this in the recent times, is we've got to get moving and we've got to stand up. And the people who do believe that, you know, come on, we need practical, sensible solutions for today's problems, and we need people to work together, we're going to have to become more vocal, stronger, more prepared to stand up against the wall of noise.
My words, not yours, but I hear you describing what I'd call a radical center. Do you really think it's possible for governments and politicians, business leaders, to be able to convince the average person today that in the world of a globalized economy, that globalization really is helpful and does not benefit just the elites? Because that is the thinking.
Yeah, it is the thinking, and it's a very difficult argument. I mean, trade is a particularly difficult argument because the people who lose from free trade can identify themselves very easily, and they feel obviously very aggrieved. The people who in time to come will benefit are unidentifiable. Okay. But by the way, there's no real doubt about the history of the world economy. The more open it is, the more people benefit. And here's the other thing which is important, is to realize that, and I think this is particularly difficult for Western countries, you know, our countries feel, particularly post the financial crisis, that they haven't really moved forward economically in the way they should. And you can look at the statistics. You know, the statistics in Britain or in the US at one level are quite good. You know, you look at the employment numbers, they seem to be quite good. You look at the growth numbers, they're not bad. But then you start to look at participation in the workforce, and then you see there's a different story. You start to look at the income levels, particularly of what you call middle class, or we would call sort of more working class incomes, and, you know, people are struggling. When you look at young people today, certainly in my country, some of them are, let's say, having to stay with their parents longer than either of them would wish it. Okay.
Same here.
Right. And, you know, you look at things like student debt and all of the, so these are real problems. Now, the strange thing is when you go to a different part of the world and you realize that actually you take the broad sweep of human progress, there's been massive change. You take a country like China, there's more people being lifted out of poverty in China than at any point in time in human history, and faster. You know, the developing world in many ways is, you know, are accessing opportunities. But we have lost that optimism about the future, and where you lose that optimism, then you get fear, and where you get fear, you get the type of politics we're describing. So we've got to go back into this, I think, in a more radical way with the things that really work. That's why, I mean, certainly in our case, I would say focusing on and doubling down on education in a far more fundamental way. I mean, the single biggest injustice you can give a child today is a poor education. Beyond doubt. I mean, the one thing that disqualifies themselves from a global economy is a poor education. Infrastructure. You know, there's major things that need to happen in order to enable the economy to grow properly. You know, you need to put yourself in a position where at least people feel that there is some fairness within the tax system and the way that people are treated. You know, there are a whole series of changes, I think, around the aging population and demography and how you deal with, we've certainly got a huge problem with social care. How do you deal with larger numbers of elderly people who need care in their lives, and how do you pay for that? And these are really difficult questions. Now, some of these questions, by the way, I think things like technology could play a major part in. I mean, if we were starting our educational healthcare systems today, we'd probably do them completely differently, just as a result of technology alone. So, center and radical, I mean, I completely agree. I think radical, though, means sensible, but answers that are really going to change things. And I think we have become, people certainly from my political position, I think have become too complacent, too much about managing the status quo, too much about saying to people, look, it's a really difficult set of decisions, which it is, by the way. Trust us to take them. I think we're not in that era anymore. And so we're going to have to do a lot of thinking, because otherwise these populist experiments of left or right will take a hold. And we do know, and we're right, they aren't answers. And if you're not careful, they will get uglier and uglier as the solutions don't come that they've promised, because actually they never really were solutions in the first place. And that's what troubles me about Europe. So you look across Europe, I mean, leave aside Britain, some of the politics, when you get someone from the far, far right, potentially winning the presidency in Austria, I mean, far, far right, then you've got to worry.
Well, Prime Minister, we have covered a lot of territory, and I am getting the signal that I can ask just one more question. So as I think about what perhaps we haven't talked about, I want to ask you, given all the issues that we have discussed, is there one source of instability in the world today, given all that's going on, that you really believe deserves even greater attention?
Well, I think you can point to specific things. North Korea would be one, which could come out of nowhere, as it were, and surprise us. But this issue of governance, I think, is the thing we should really focus on. And let me just, you see, if you take, I could give you some examples of countries, right? You take Poland and Ukraine. When both came out of the Soviet Union, both had roughly the same population, roughly the same GDP per head, probably Ukraine slightly more resources. Today, Poland's a successful first world country. Ukraine is what we know. Colombia and Venezuela. Okay. Rwanda and Burundi, next door to each other, exactly the same populations, exactly the same issues. One is a successful country on its way to becoming second world. The other is how we know. And then the biggest experiment in governance the world has ever seen, which is the Korean Peninsula. South Korea, a first world country, North Korea. So I think one thing we should concentrate on today is helping these governments in some of the poorest parts of the world, particularly when they have this potential to be used in this extremist setting. We should be helping them, building institutional resilience with them. I'm thinking of these countries like your Malis and your Chads and your Nigers, and the population in all these countries, by the way, is growing enormously. I mean, Nigeria is today a country of 180 million people, split equally between Christian and Muslim. By 2030, it's going to be 300 million, right? Egypt is a country that 50 years ago was 30 million, today it's over 90 million. Niger itself could be a country of 100 million people, not Nigeria, Niger. Right? So I think that is one of the things we could concentrate on, and we could concentrate on helping them with the single biggest problem of government. And I will finish on this because it's what made a big difference to the work that I do now. So as I was explaining yesterday, what happens in the British system is that, first of all, we have two big differences with the American system. Okay, the first is that our election campaigns are 4 weeks.
We need that. Wow.
We need that.
The second, which I think in some ways is not so smart, is that you have the election, so you fight the election, it's always on a Thursday, and then you win the election, the next day you're in government. Right? There's no transitional preparations, you're just there. Okay. So my party had been out of power for 18 years when I came to office in 1997. And so I step into Downing Street on the Friday morning for the first time. And there's a set of traditions with the British system. So what happens is, before the new guy arrives, the old guy packs his bags and he leaves, right? And what happens is the staff of Downing Street, the permanent staff who are there for whatever the Prime Minister is, they line up on either side of the corridor going down from the front door down to the cabinet room, right? And they applaud the old Prime Minister out, right? So he carries his bags out the back door, and then a bit later, in comes the victor, right, with his bags, and then they're supposed to applaud him in. Okay, so the other guy goes out, I come in the front door. Now, as I say, we've been out of power for 18 years, so they're quite used to the other lot, right? So I go down the ranks where they're supposed to be clapping and cheering, and they're weeping. So I get down to the end of the line, and I'm kind of feeling guilty about the whole thing. I mean, I just won this election, upset all these people. But anyway, we go into the cabinet room at the end, and they're just the two chairs there, and sitting in the other chair is the head of the civil service, who's a non-political appointment in the UK. So he also stays with the new person, and he sort of motioned me to the other seat, and then he says to me in that sort of very clipped British way, he says to me, "Well done." And then he said, "Now what?" And basically the whole of the rest of my time in politics has been spent in answering that question.
Well, Prime Minister Blair, thank you so very much for this conversation. Thank you. Well done. Well done. Well done. Wow, look. What a surprise. How are you? Wow.
So, you now have some idea of how much fun it was to be in office when Tony Blair was there. And I just want to tell you that, first, thank you for being here. Thank you for coming and alleviating the repetitive nature of the Bush-Clinton roadshow yesterday. And thank you for sharing your thoughts with all these good people. When Tony Blair was elected, I was literally over the moon because I thought there would be two of us who believed that we could build a new sort of economy, a new kind of a society, and we wound up getting all these allies, winning in the strangest places, Italy, Sweden, everywhere. What broke it, interestingly enough, was not the failure of our model, but 9/11, where insecurities started to dominate and doubts started to form and distrust started to dominate the political narratives. So that's the last thing I want to leave you with. We all need good stories that capture the moment. At the moment, you heard what Tony was saying. There are lots of reasons for people to be resentful, to be angry, whether they're coal miners who think they'll never make a decent living again, or young people in the Black Lives Matter movement who are scared to walk outside on the street, or police officers in Dallas who think that they did everything right and still got targeted because of the color of their uniform, not the color of their skin. There are always reasons. There are always problems. So it is really important to make sure that every time you hear somebody tell a bad story, you got a good one. Which is why what he said about Burundi and Rwanda, two countries I've been heavily involved with over a long period of time, but especially in Rwanda, is important. I'll bet you anything, if you went up to 1,000 people on the street today in Little Rock, you couldn't find 10 who could tell you a good story about the Middle East. But year before last, the United Arab Emirates displaced Norway as the country giving the highest percentage of its income in foreign assistance to poor countries in the world. Does that mean you shouldn't worry about ISIS? Of course not. Does that mean everything's going to be fine in Syria tomorrow? Absolutely not. Does that mean there should be no security checks when you take migrants? No. But it does mean that you can't just live with a bad story and give up on the future before you start and vote for the lowest common denominator. So I just want to leave you with that. I tell everybody that the best political book I've read, I know in a decade, is E.O. Wilson's The Social Conquest of Earth. And he won 2 Nobel Prizes in microbiology. Before I read that book, the only thing I could tell you for sure is that E.O. Wilson was the first person who told me that the combined weight of all the ants on Earth was greater than the combined weight of all the people on Earth. But in this little book, which you can read in a couple of hours, he gives you the general principle that underlines Tony Blair's entire life and public life. He said, if you look at the history of all life on Earth, not just human beings, it's nearly as we can know it. The great triumphant species defined triumph is they had a lot of chance to get you and failed, and you're still around. Are ants, termites, bees, and people. And that they all survived because they were adaptable. Like, the last thing you'd ever hear either one of us say that if you just did what we did in the 90s, it would work well today. Some of it would, actually, but not all of it. They were adaptable, and they adapted through cooperation. And it's a fascinating book. He tells you all the fascinating ways that ants and termites and bees have cooperated. Since then, there have been interesting things. Spiders are largely solitary. There are more than 2,400 kinds of spiders on Earth, and for some reason, no one knows. 24 species have begun to triumph because they're making spider webs together for the first time in all of human history. No one knows why. You're laughing, but it's important that you know this. You think everything's going to hell in a handbasket because of everything you read every day. And so the moral of this book is that human beings are the greatest survivors. They had lots of chances to be wiped out, starting with the fact that the Neanderthals were bigger and stronger than we were, and even though they couldn't speak, their brains were bigger than ours. They just didn't work quite as well. And he said it's because when the chips were down, we always found a way to work together to meet our current challenges or seize our opportunities, and we avoided not only being destroyed, but elevated the meaning of human life on Earth. And it was only because of our uncanny capacity to cooperate. The most famous old joke, stale joke in the history of British American politics is how long it took Roosevelt, who loved Churchill, to get into World War II. And Mr. Churchill said at one of his endless press conferences with the press berating him for why his buddy Roosevelt wouldn't get into the war, he said the United States invariably does the right thing after exhausting every other alternative. And Wilson says that that's the thing about people. We are better cooperators than ants, termites, and bees because we have two things they don't: consciousness and a conscience. The problem is we know it, and it makes us arrogant, so we keep trying to find excuses to avoid doing what deep in our hearts we would know is the right thing to do. And biologically, we are predetermined to do that. That's where we are right now. We are in the growing pains of globalization. And that man who went crazy driving that truck in Paris is an example of it. What happened in Orlando and San Bernardino is an example. Even if the people turn out to be mentally ill and deranged, they're picking up the zeitgeist. So the only thing I want to say is, if you can't do anything about that because you're not in law enforcement or security, you need to make more good stories. And you need to make sure people know there are good stories. And every time somebody talks about the Burundi, you need to have the Rwanda answer. Because it is not clear what the outcome of this will be. And I'm not just talking about an imminent election. I mean the ongoing attempt of people to broaden their brains and their hearts to accommodate everything. I don't think I ever had a time, even when we had our occasional arguments, and believe it or not, we had an argument or two, when I didn't hang up the phone or walk out of the room saying, I'm so glad that guy's where he is. I'm so glad there's somebody who's thinking about how to give people better stories. I'm so glad that there's somebody who keeps score the way I do. Does this work or not? Not does it sound good, not does it make me feel good. Does this work? Are more people going to have a chance to live better lives if I do X than Y? That's all you can ever hope for. You'll never find anybody in any position who will never make a mistake. But that's what Tony Blair's governance means to me. That's what my experience was. He tried to figure things out, explain it to people, come up with something that made sense. And it elevated the level of cooperation among people who were otherwise disinclined to do it. And the country was better off. The reason that I didn't like Brexit is I thought it would reduce the level of cooperation and increase the level of dysfunction at a time when the last thing we need is something else that doesn't work as well as it used to work. So his life and friendship have been a gift to me, and our differences have made our relationship more stimulating. And the last gift he gave was to come home and do what he did for you. So I thank you very much.